Introduction. Welcome back to Historia Prime, the channel where we dig deep into the past to uncover the forgotten survival skills, hidden knowledge, and self-reliant secrets that empower our modern lives. In 2015, the Federal Trade Commission released a study that quietly shook the auto industry. They found that American consumers were being systematically overcharged for vehicle repairs, with surface cosmetic work topping the list of complaints. The average markup on a minor scratch repair sat somewhere between 800 and 1,200% above material cost. Not 8%, not 80%, 800 to 1,200%. Think about what that means. A repair costing $2 to $4 in materials was being invoiced at $300, $400, sometimes $500. And the customer paid it every single time because they believed they had no other choice. You have probably lived this exact moment. You walked out to your car one morning and saw it. A scratch cutting straight across the paint on your door. The one a shopping cart left sitting there in the lot. You pulled out your phone, searched for the repair cost, and saw $300, then $400 more. You went to a body shop. A professional handed you a printed estimate on official-looking paper, shook his head slowly, and said, "This kind of thing adds up." But what if that estimate had almost nothing to do with the actual cost of the fix? What if the gap between the material price and the price on that invoice was not driven by complexity, but by a business model that depends on you never learning how simple the repair actually is? There is a liquid sitting at your local auto parts store right now, priced between $2 and $5, that addresses every surface scratch on your vehicle. Not temporarily masked, functionally restored. The auto body industry has understood this chemistry for decades, but a $2 fix cannot sustain a $400 invoice. So the economics of the industry were never designed to tell you about it. Nobody needed to hold a secret meeting or sign a non-disclosure agreement. No one had to conspire. The incentive structure did the work all by itself. When an unpatentable product generates no recurring revenue and no licensing fees, no marketing budget appears to promote it. When a repair takes 60 seconds instead of 3 billable hours, no shop has a reason to recommend it. The silence was not orchestrated. It was simply profitable. Throughout history, the ultimate survival skill was never just about starting a fire or purifying water. It was about seeing the difference between what something costs and what someone charges you. Today, we are going to break down the material science behind a $2 repair, expose the real scams hiding at the cheap end of the market, and hand you a practical skill that saves real money starting tonight. Let us get into it. 1. The engineered complexity barrier. To understand how a $2 liquid stayed invisible for this long, you need to understand a pattern that shows up across every era of history. Whenever a simple solution threatens a profitable system, the system does not attack the solution directly. It builds a wall of complexity around the problem, so the average person never even attempts to solve it themselves. The auto body repair industry generates roughly $47 billion in annual revenue across the United States. Surface scratches are not the biggest single category of that revenue, but they serve a critical function. They are the entry point. A scratch brings a first-time customer through the door. That customer becomes a relationship. That relationship becomes recurring maintenance, upsells on paint protection packages, and referrals. A permanent $2 home repair eliminates that entire funnel. So the industry did what every threatened institution has always done. It built a complexity barrier. Dense technical language was deployed to create the impression that car paint is hopelessly complicated. You heard terms like base coat, clear coat, tri-stage pearl, and single-stage urethane. Certification programs emerged, requiring expensive training hours. Dealerships began bundling paint protection packages at checkout for $1,000 to $2,000, and the message repeated across every platform was always the same. You cannot do this yourself. You will make it worse. Trust us. The goal was never to help you understand your vehicle. The goal was to make you believe the problem was beyond your ability to solve. And it worked, for decades, on millions of people. But here is the thing about complexity barriers. They only hold as long as nobody walks you through the other side. So let us walk through it. 2. The ancient element in a modern bottle. The liquid is called silicon dioxide detailing spray, sometimes marketed as SiO2 ceramic spray. You can find it at Walmart, Amazon, or your local auto parts store for between $2 and $5. You have probably walked directly past it on the shelf dozens of times without knowing what it does. Silicon dioxide is one of the most abundant compounds on the surface of the Earth. It is the primary component of sand, quartz, and glass. But the story of how it ended up in a $4 spray bottle at your auto parts store is more interesting than most people realize. In the 1860s, a French chemist named Jacques-Joseph Ebelman was experimenting with a process that would later be called sol-gel chemistry. He discovered that certain compounds could be dissolved into a liquid solution, then allowed to solidify into a hard, glass-like material at room temperature. It was a laboratory curiosity at the time. Nobody had a practical use for it. Fast forward a century. The American aerospace industry in the 1960s needed coatings that could withstand extreme temperatures, chemical exposure, and physical abrasion on aircraft and spacecraft surfaces. Researchers turned to sol-gel-derived ceramic coatings, and silicon dioxide emerged as one of the most effective protective compounds available. NASA used it. The military used it. The automotive manufacturing sector noticed. By the 1980s, ceramic coatings based on silicon dioxide nanoparticles were being integrated into OEM manufacturing processes. The technology was applied during final quality control stages to protect factory paint before vehicles shipped to dealerships. The chemistry was proven, the performance was documented, and the cost of the raw compound was almost nothing. In modern formulations, silicon dioxide is engineered into nanoparticles, typically ranging from 1 to 100 nanometers in diameter. At the molecular level, this compound bonds to your clear coat, the transparent protective film over your car's paint. When a key or a cart scratches through that film, the clear coat fractures. The silicon dioxide liquid flows directly into that microscopic channel, filling the fracture. Then, at ambient temperature, the compound begins curing through the sol-gel process, hardening into a crystalline structure that reaches 9H on the pencil hardness scale. Now, a quick note on that hardness rating, because this is where a lot of misinformation circulates online. The 9H pencil hardness scale is an industry-specific test used for coatings. It is not the Mohs scale, which measures mineral hardness, and where 9 would mean you are approaching sapphire territory. Pencil hardness 9H is impressive for a surface coating. It means the cured layer resists scratching from the hardest standard graphite pencil. But it is not sapphire. Anyone who tells you a spray bottle produces sapphire hardness coating is either confused or selling you something. What it does mean, honestly, is that the cured coating is harder than your original factory clear coat. That is a verifiable, meaningful improvement. $2. 160 years of chemistry. From a French laboratory to NASA to the shelf at your local Walmart. 3. The optical trick your eyes cannot resist. Now here is where the science gets genuinely fascinating and where most people misunderstand what is actually happening. A scratch is visible because it disrupts the uniform surface of the clear coat. The fracture creates jagged microscopic edges that scatter incoming light in multiple directions. Your eye perceives that scattered light as a white or dull line against the paint. Silicon dioxide coatings have a high refractive index. When the liquid fills the microscopic valleys created by the scratch and cures into a hard, smooth surface, it levels the plane at a nanoscopic scale. Light that was being scattered in chaotic directions now reflects uniformly, the same way it does off undamaged paint. The scratch becomes invisible to the naked eye. But here is the honest truth that most videos and product listings will never tell you. The scratch is still physically there beneath the coating. The fracture in your clear coat has not been filled in the way a dentist fills a cavity. It has been bridged. The silicon dioxide creates a new, smooth surface on top of the damage that controls how light behaves across that spot. It is, at its core, an optical illusion. But because the liquid cures into a hard, crystalline structure through the sol gel process, this illusion becomes a semi-permanent physical reality. It does not wash off. It does not evaporate. It endures weather, UV exposure, and normal wear. That distinction matters. This is not a magic eraser. It is a material science solution that works within honest physical limits. And understanding those limits is what separates someone who gets a great result from someone who ends up disappointed. It also raises a question worth sitting with. How many problems in our lives do not actually need to be completely excavated and rebuilt from the ground up? How many just need to be leveled out and seen in a different light? 4. The Cold War shortcut that backfires. If you have spent any time looking into scratch removal online, you have seen people recommending WD-40. And to be fair, there is a reason it seems to work. But as students of history, we owe it to ourselves to understand why it fails. WD-40 stands for water displacement, 40th formula. In 1953, a small team at the Rocket Chemical Company in San Diego developed it to protect the outer skin of the Atlas missile from rust and corrosion. The product was never intended for consumer use. Engineers at Convair, the company building the Atlas, were applying it by hand to the missile's thin stainless steel shell to prevent moisture damage during storage. It worked so well that employees started sneaking cans home to use around the house. The company noticed, and a consumer product was born. WD-40 is primarily composed of mineral oil and aliphatic hydrocarbons. When you spray it on a scratch, the oils fill the void and level the surface, creating the exact same optical illusion we just described with silicon dioxide. The scratch seems to disappear for about 20 minutes. The difference is that WD-40 does not cross-link or form a chemical bond with the paint surface. It sits on top as a wet film. The first rainstorm washes it away. The first hot afternoon evaporates it. And because it is a wet oil, it acts as a magnet for road dust and grit. Wiping away that accumulated grime with a towel drags abrasive particles across your paint. The result? More scratches than you started with. WD-40 is a brilliant product for what it was designed to do: displacing moisture, loosening rusted bolts, protecting metal. Using it as a scratch repair is like using a Band-Aid as a roof patch. It covers the problem until the first storm hits. True self-reliance means understanding the chemistry of the tools you reach for. 5. The $2 trap. Now, here is the critical plot twist that most videos on this topic will never give you. And this is the part that matters most. While the science of silicon dioxide is legitimate, the extreme cheap end of this market is a minefield. If you buy a highly unregulated ceramic spray from platforms with minimal quality control, you might be stepping into a different kind of trap entirely. Many inexpensive ceramic sprays use aggressive solvents to keep the nanoparticles dissolved in the bottle. These cheap solvents often contain high levels of volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. When inhaled, these toxic compounds can cause headaches, dizziness, and respiratory irritation. Chronic exposure has been linked to damage affecting the liver, kidneys, and central nervous system. We are talking about real health consequences from a product you are spraying inches from your face. And the damage is not limited to your body. Poorly formulated liquids with extreme pH levels can cause chemical etching, permanently destroying the clear coat you are trying to protect. You end up worse than where you started, with damage that now genuinely does require professional repair. This is the moment to steelman the other side. Professional ceramic coating services that charge $800 to $1,500 are not charging you for a bottle of liquid. The true cost lies in 10 to 40 hours of skilled labor, paint decontamination, iron particle removal, heavy machine polishing to physically correct the paint surface before the coating is ever applied. Applying any coating, cheap or expensive, over a dirty or damaged panel traps contaminants beneath a hardened layer. That is a recipe for failure. So here is the real landscape. On one side, an industry that has a financial incentive to convince you that every scratch requires a $500 professional repair. On the other side, unregulated sellers pushing toxic formulations for pennies. The survival skill is navigating between these two extremes. Buying a reputable retail-grade silicon dioxide spray from a recognized brand at your local auto parts store for $3 to $5 and applying it correctly yourself. That is the sweet spot. 6. The 60-second repair. So let us put this knowledge to work. The actual procedure for an at-home surface scratch repair using a safe, retail-grade silicon dioxide spray is almost absurdly simple. It was documented in technical bulletins for years, buried in jargon that was never meant for consumer eyes. First, wash the scratched panel completely with soap and water and allow it to dry fully. Any dirt or debris left on the surface will get trapped under the coating. Second, place 3 drops of the compound onto a clean microfiber pad. 3 drops, not a handful. More product does not mean better results. Third, work the pad into the scratch using small circular motions, applying steady, even pressure for about 60 seconds. Fourth, and this is the part most people skip, allow the treated surface to cure untouched for 24 hours. Do not wash it, do not touch it, do not test it. The sol gel process needs time to complete the chemical cross-linking that creates the hard, crystalline surface. No sanding, no repainting, no mechanic. 60 seconds of active work and 1 day of patience. A few honest caveats. This method works on surface-level clear coat scratches, the kind you can feel lightly with a fingernail but that have not penetrated through to the base paint layer. If you run your nail across the scratch and it catches hard, or if you can see bare metal or primer underneath, you are dealing with a deeper issue that genuinely benefits from professional attention. This is not a failure of the method, it is understanding its honest limits. Deep scratches that penetrate the base coat or expose bare metal involve structural paint damage that a surface coating cannot bridge. For the 80 to 90% of everyday scratches that sit in the clear coat, this works. $3 to $5. 60 seconds. Done. 6. The 60-second repair. So let us put this knowledge to work. The actual procedure for an at-home surface scratch repair using a safe, retail-grade silicon dioxide spray is almost absurdly simple. It was documented in technical bulletins for years, buried in jargon that was never meant for consumer eyes. First, wash the scratched panel completely with soap and water and allow it to dry fully. Any dirt or debris left on the surface will get trapped under the coating. Second, place 3 drops of the compound onto a clean microfiber pad. 3 drops, not a handful. More product does not mean better results. Third, work the pad into the scratch using small circular motions, applying steady, even pressure for about 60 seconds. Fourth, and this is the part most people skip, allow the treated surface to cure untouched for 24 hours. Do not wash it, do not touch it, do not test it. The sol gel process needs time to complete the chemical cross-linking that creates the hard crystalline surface. No sanding, no repainting, no mechanic. 60 seconds of active work and 1 day of patience. A few honest caveats. This method works on surface-level clear coat scratches, the kind you can feel lightly with a fingernail but that have not penetrated through to the base paint layer. If you run your nail across the scratch and it catches hard, or if you can see bare metal or primer underneath, you are dealing with a deeper issue that genuinely benefits from professional attention. This is not a failure of the method, it is understanding its honest limits. Deep scratches that penetrate the base coat or expose bare metal involve structural paint damage that a surface coating cannot bridge. For the 80 to 90% of everyday scratches that sit in the clear coat, this works. $3 to $5, 60 seconds. Done. Conclusion. Every car on every street has at least one scratch. And nearly every owner was told the same thing, that the fix was expensive, that it required a professional, that attempting it at home would only make things worse. That message was never really about protecting you. It was about protecting a revenue stream. Not through some grand conspiracy, but through the quiet, self-sustaining logic of a business model that has no incentive to teach you what a $2 bottle can do. Remember that moment in the parking lot? The scratch on your door, the estimate on official-looking paper, the slow headshake. That moment cost you money you never needed to spend. Not because someone was evil, because the system was designed so that no one in it had a reason to tell you the truth. But you know it now, and that changes the equation. This is not just a car repair tip. This is a pattern that repeats across every industry, every era, every economy in history. Simple solutions get buried, not by villains, but by structures. The people who thrive are the ones who learn to see past the complexity barrier and ask one question. What does this actually cost to fix? If this video gave you something real, if it shifted how you see the gap between what things cost and what you get charged, subscribe to Historia Prime. Share this with someone who is paying a body shop hundreds of dollars right now for a problem that takes 60 seconds and 3 drops of a liquid that has been sitting on a shelf waiting for decades. Stay curious, stay reliant on yourself, and remember, the next one is coming soon.